Thanks to everyone who has joined us. This is the Compassion in Action webinar series, part 4, Treating the Whole Person, Faith and Mental Health Professionals Partnering to Address Mental Illness. I'll now turn the presentation over to our moderator, Shannon Royce. Shannon?
Thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate your assistance in setting up the details for this and your just perfect welcoming voice for all of our webinars. It's really great to have you as a part of our team. Thank you all for joining us. We're so grateful that you're with us today. My name is Shannon Royce, and it's my privilege to serve as the director of the Center for Faith and Opportunity Initiatives, or what we call the Partnership Center. It's a little easier to remember. We are the fourth of our 5 series, Compassion in Action webinar series, to address our latest resource, the Compassion in Action Guide that Ben mentioned as he did our intro. We're grateful to have you join us today as we consider treating the whole person. Faith and mental health professionals partner to address mental illness. We will be focusing on principles 4 and 5 from the guide today. But before we do that and before we introduce our speakers, I have a few details just to make sure we're all on the same page. This is an educational webinar, not intended for the press. So if you are a member of the press, we would ask that you allow us at the end of the program to connect you with the Assistant Secretary of Public Affairs. This is an off-the-record webinar for educational purposes. If you're having difficulty hearing, we find some people, depending on how they come into the program, sometimes have difficulty hearing us. So if you are having difficulty hearing, we would encourage you to just call in to the phone number at the bottom of the screen that Zoom provides. Some people have better luck hearing when they call in rather than using their computer audio to hear the program. Finally, we do have a full program, and we will be taking as many questions at the end as we are able to. So if you will please go to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and put your questions in as we go through the program and through our speakers today, then we'll get to as many questions as we're able to. The Compassion in Action Guide is broken into 7 key principles to provide a foundation for serving people experiencing mental illness and their caregivers. We came to these principles through several in-person and online engagements that we did with different professionals from different backgrounds, as well as people living with serious mental illness and their caregivers. In addressing faith and mental health, we heard that it's important that services to individuals with mental illness and their caregivers align with the training and skills held by faith leaders and by clinical professionals. Mental health professionals and faith leaders benefit from working together and supporting each other's professional respective expertise and training. And this in turn better serves people living with serious mental illness and their caregivers. This webinar today will describe how faith leaders can make effective referrals to mental health professionals, as well as share some examples of projects we've worked with over these last couple of years that we think will be helpful and beneficial to you as you consider how you can engage in serving people with mental illness and their caregivers. Today we have 2 sets of presenters, and I'm going to introduce them separately. We'll introduce the first set, they will speak, and then we'll introduce the second set and have them speak. First, we have Dave Eckert from Access Services and Doug Moister from Renew Community. Dave Eckert is the director of Intersect, an initiative within Access Services that supports those at the intersection of faith and mental health through consultation, training, and the fostering of collaboration between faith communities and mental health providers. He spent 19 years working for Access within various roles, including as the director of the Mobile Psychiatric Rehabilitation Program and agency chaplain. In addition, Dave has served in the role of associate pastor of Grace Community Church in Chalfont, Pennsylvania for the last 12 years. He lives with his wife and 3 children in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. He'll be joined by Doug Moister, who serves on staff as the lead pastor at Renew Community in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. Besides his pastoral and preaching duties with Renew, Doug is a lifelong learner, a church history nerd, a coach in the community, and an enthusiastic fly fisherman. Doug has been married to Mir for 19 years. They enjoy spending time watching their 2 teenagers play sports and loving on their neighborhood. Dave, I believe we'll start with you first.
Thank you, Shannon and the Partnership Center, for giving me this opportunity to speak with you this morning about the Intersect Initiative. My hope is, in talking with you about this initiative, there might be certain ideas from what we're doing that might be actionable in your own space in the country. As Shannon mentioned, I've been in this work for 19 years within the public mental health field. And I've been, during much of that time, 12 of those years, I've also been serving as a pastor. And as I've been living in these 2 worlds, I've learned a couple things. One thing I've learned is that mental health professionals often struggle to pay attention to the spiritual dimension of people that they serve. Yet at the same time, a lot of times, faith communities are struggling to know, how do I serve, come alongside people in my congregation who are wrestling with their mental health? And in inhabiting both of these worlds for such a long time and seeing each of these struggles to pay attention to the whole person, we started this initiative called Intersect. And this is the mission of Intersect. It's to support those standing at the intersection of faith and mental illness through consultation, training, and fostering collaboration between faith communities at the mental health field. So with Intersect, we wanted to be able to help both of those worlds that I have been inhabiting come together and be able to care for the whole person, which is what each wanted to do, but had some struggles doing. Now, this Intersect Initiative, which I'm going to explain more about in a moment and unpack this mission, it's embedded within a social service organization called Access Services. And these are just some of the different programs within Access. We serve both people with mental illness and intellectual disabilities. The reason I'm sharing with you these different programs is because our work is to come alongside these programs and to help the staff there know how to best serve, support the spiritual needs of people that they've been asked to help, but also help the the faith-based organizations or the faith communities be able to access these different services for reasons that I'll share in a moment aren't always as easy as we would hope. So Intersect is one of the initiatives within this umbrella of Access Services and these different programs. So now let's take some time to talk with you about these 3 different areas I mentioned that comes out of Intersect's mission: consultation, training, and fostering collaboration between mental health providers and faith communities. So first, consultation. We provide consultation both to mental health providers and to faith communities. And I have an example from each for you. One is that I had been getting a call for a number of months from a clinician at a outpatient mental health center locally. And this is what the clinician would say to me: Dave, can I call you whenever someone comes to be served by me and mentions God or faith? Because I'm not a person of faith, I'm an atheist, and I don't know what to say to them. And I said, sure, you can, give me a call. I'd be happy to help in any way. But what I think would be most helpful to your practice is if we could talk together about ways you could help this person see their faith as a resource for their wellness and recovery. And maybe we could work with some of your other staff as well. So there are times I've received calls and opportunities from mental health practitioners who are asking, how do I do this work of assessing and supporting spiritual needs and connecting to faith communities in our region? But I also get calls from clergy. And one example of a call that I had received for consultation was a clergy member who said, Dave, there's someone in my church who's hearing voices, and I'm going to ask him not to come back until those voices go away. And like some of you may have thought, wow, like just stunned by that call. But what had happened as I learned more from this pastor was that this had been after some synagogue shootings that occurred. And the pastor was very much concerned that as the shepherd of his church, he was going to not do something he should do to protect his church. And he assumed wrongly that because this person was hearing voices, he must be a violent threat to his faith community. So what we were able to do in providing consultation is help this pastor see there are other ways you can do risk assessment for your congregation instead of asking this man not to come back. And then we were able to meet with this man and meet with the pastor and help empower the man to be able to tell the pastor, you know, these voices, they're hard, but this community, this church really helps me more than anything else to provide support and help me manage them. So if I can't be part of this church anymore, that's going to be worse for me and my voices, not better. And the pastor was able to, through these conversations, see that there were other ways of responding. And while we might think, I can't believe this pastor thought to call and say that he was going to ask this man not to come back to church, what I'm grateful for is that the pastor felt like he had one conversation partner, some person he could call in the mental health system to think this through. Because if they don't have anyone they can call for consultation, they're just going to keep it to themselves. And who knows how many other situations like this happen every day because clergy doesn't know who is safe to call. So this is the first thing we do in Intersect. We provide consultation. We also provide training. So we provide training to the mental health system. One training is spiritual tools and resources for practitioners, where we help mental health practitioners learn how to assess and support spiritual needs, as well as connect people they serve to faith communities and faith-based resources of their choosing. And it always strikes me that when I have one of these trainings and I open it up for conversation and I say, so tell me why you came today. With, you know, every time we do this, I'll hear someone say, I'm here because I don't know of any other trainings like this in our public system. So just having these trainings available within your public system of care can really be helpful because they're just not there according to the people I'm hearing from. In addition to trainings for the mental health system, we also have trainings for faith communities, and I list some of them there. A training on faith and mental health, and we look at 5 myths that people both in faith communities and people in social services have about this intersection. Also a training on supporting those in your congregation and community with mental illness. And then finally, one we've begun doing amidst the pandemic, which is maintaining mental wellness during times of crisis. There's one conversation I had that really showed me the value of this sort of training. It was after I had spoken at a faith community, and a man came up to me afterwards. He was actually one of the leaders in the community. And he said to me, I'm taking my daughter to a psychiatrist tomorrow, but I didn't know I could talk about that here until today. Until we had this space to train the congregation, to train the leadership, this man just thought, due to the air he breathed within his faith community, that I shouldn't talk to anyone about my experience with my daughter. So one of the reasons it's so important to provide training, in addition to equipping people, is just to create space where people come out of the woodwork and feel like they can partake in conversation. So with Intersect, again, we've provided consultation and training to both of these worlds I'm talking about. And then finally, we foster collaboration. A few examples of why we do this and how we do it. One reason is to make it easier for congregations to make referrals. I've had a number of pastors and clergy in different faith traditions say to me almost the same exact thing, which is this: I don't make referrals to mental health providers because I don't know who I can trust. They feel that they're kept out of treatment team meetings. They feel like their faith of their congregant isn't appreciated and used as a resource. So they decide, I'm just not going to reach out for help. And that's why, again, having a conversation partner, having someone they can trust, which is what we're trying to do with Intersect, allows for them to call and just say, do you know of any resources in the mental health field that can help this person that I'm struggling to help as a pastor? The other reason we want to foster collaboration between these two worlds is what we could call the silo effect, which is where faith communities and mental health providers, though they both want to help the broader community and serve oftentimes are in their own silos and not connecting with one another to collaborate for the common good. I remember one occasion I was leading a conversation between a number of clergy and a number of human service providers. And as I was moderating this conversation, one of the faith leaders said this to this group of mental health professionals: "I didn't even know you guys existed." This man had been serving in his community for many years, but he just didn't know these different organizations that were out there. And then just after the conversation, a drug and alcohol provider comes up to me and says, "Dave, I've never been part of a conversation like this before." This isn't because there's something amazing that we're doing in Intersect. This is simply showing a gap within our public systems of care, that there aren't spaces for these conversations that bring people together. And then the other reason we try to foster collaboration is to make win-win connections. We believe both faith communities and mental health providers win. They become, as we're saying in this presentation, they're better able to care for the whole person and better able to be what they want to be when they collaborate. So for example, I remember for years as I directed a mobile psych rehab clinic or team, I remember thinking, we're discharging people to nothing. You know, we get to this point where we've provided a really quality service, but at the point of discharge, we're hearing people we're going to discharge tell us, "You're my only friend. Don't abandon me." And we realized we talk a good game about community integration, but we're not always doing it in concrete ways. And on the other side, in faith communities, they need help with this too. I had someone from my own faith community come up to me and say, "I really want to serve people in my community, but everyone on my street looks like they're doing okay." And immediately he said that, I was struck by the fact that I know his street, and I knew that we at Access were serving someone 3 doors down from him. And I thought, if only we could connect people like this from faith communities who say, "I want to serve my community, but I don't know where the needs are," with people from organizations like Access who every day are getting calls about where the needs are. So this is the reason that we foster collaboration between these two worlds. Now, what I want to do in closing is just give you an idea for some ways you could operationalize collaboration wherever you are. One thing to consider, which is what my organization did, was to have a person in the organization that's responsible for this. They would need to have a few characteristics. One, credibility through experience in both of these worlds. If you have experience in faith communities and experience in mental health organizations, then each of those spaces trusts you to understand where they're coming from and trusts you to collaborate well in a way that helps further each's mission. Also, by having credibility in both worlds, you might have the experience that allows you to effectively translate terms unique to each world, so that when one side says, "We want socialization for our people," and the other side says, "We want fellowship," or when one side says, "We want to be able to do service, serve people well," and the other side says, "We want to minister to people well," that you can translate those terms and help each understand that actually this is a point of connection. And by being able to have that credibility and do that translation work, you might be able to connect these organizations and faith communities. So consider, is there someone in your organization, or might this be something to consider having within your organization that fits alongside your other services? Another thing you could try doing to operationalize collaboration is to set up a care portal. We have recently started what we call our Intersect Community Needs Facebook page, where the people in Access Services who are staff members, mental health professionals, will post the needs. They're still being HIPAA compliant, but posting needs of people they serve on this care portal, this Facebook page. And then people from faith communities join this page and are able to learn what those needs are. And now faith communities can serve people in their area that they would have never known to serve without this portal. And these people that we're serving at Access Services are now able to get their needs met in ways that go beyond just us as a service provider. And then finally, a thing to consider in operationalizing collaboration is a multi-faith coalition. This is something we started in our county over the last year and a half. And this is really a multi-sector coalition. It convenes together people from human services, faith communities, and county government, so that we can work together in fostering dialogue and collaboration for the common good. And I am one of the chairs representing mental health providers. There's another chair representing faith communities and another chair representing health and human services in our county. And this has been a great way to just bring people together. And when we bring people together, amazing things occur. As a colleague of mine said to me yesterday, proximity is its own reward. When we facilitate getting proximate with one another across these sectors, then we all of a sudden see collaboration taking place. Now, what we want to do at this point, that was kind of a 30,000 view take on Intersect, but we've had the joy within Intersect of working with different faith leaders, Doug Moister being one of them. And Doug is going to share, as a faith leader, his own experience being able to collaborate within our Intersect initiative. So, Doug.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, so I've been super blessed as a pastor to have opportunities to work alongside with Dave and Intersect. And many pastors who come out of seminary feel very much equipped to teach the Bible and to be with people. But when mental health comes in, there's not a lot of preparation work that happens in much of the education process that folks like me receive. And what's interesting is when you come out into the streets, you start to look like, man, who are the people of peace that I can trust, that I can move towards, that can help me to figure out what does it look like to support and care for people in my community that may be part of my church or just my neighbors that may be struggling or living with mental health reality in wherever they are. And so we like to look at ourselves in our community to recognize that our church is part of a constellation of care and support for each individual that's part of our community. And what's been so great is Access and Dave specifically have been so helpful in making the connection to help us understand how to care and support for people within our community and even for pastors within our community who are struggling with mental illness. One really quick story, I get a phone call from Dave a few years ago and he says, hey, there's a gentleman that is interested in checking out a church. And I think he'd be a good fit for you guys. And here are some of his needs. He really needs people that are going to journey with him, that are going to listen, that are going to care, and that are going to be consistent in his life. And so myself and Dave and this gentleman, we met over coffee at Starbucks and we had this fantastic conversation. And I was so encouraged by the honest and raw questions that this gentleman asked and the freedom and almost the way that you could tell the Intersect was really helping to foster this beautiful relationship. 3 years later, he's still part of our community. He's experienced the literal word community like he hasn't before. And I think what's fantastic about the overlap of seeing Intersect and the faith community, the mental health community and the faith community come together is all of a sudden it levels the playing field and it recognizes that he still needs his counselor. He still needs his meds. He still needs the things that are being offered through the county and through all the different services that he is using. But he also needs community that's going to walk with him, that's going to drive him to appointments, that's going to be present with him through the ups and downs and is just going to be with that person. And for us as the faith community, I really feel like the greatest thing that we have is presence. Just to be with people, to walk with people. I have never made a diagnosis. I don't ask Dave the question of, well, what's this person's diagnosis? I just say, how do we best care for them? And even allowing the person who comes into our community to say, how can we best care for you? What would be helpful for us to know? And so for us, we've just found that to be so helpful on an individual level. On a bigger level within our church, Dave has come and done some training for understanding trauma, understanding how the mental health community and Renew specifically can join together, what it looks like to care for people, what it looks like to provide support. And those have been really helpful conversations and enriched the folks within our community who have a heart and a passion to just journey and walk with others. And then on another level, I also lead a podcast called The Monday Morning Pastor with a Friend. And it's been this really interesting experiment, so to speak, where we've just been telling stories and listening to stories of pastors and what their experience is. And we've noticed very early on, we're in our fourth season or coming up to our fourth season, that there are a lot of pastors that are struggling with mental health. in this season. And we had Dave on to be able to talk to pastors on a national level about what is going on and how to understand what's happening in mental health and what it looks like to be well and what it looks like to pastor people who are struggling with mental health illness in the season that we find ourselves in. And so I'm just really grateful to have Dave and Intersect. And I feel like as a pastor, I have such confidence. And on the flip side, so he sent people to us. What I also appreciate is when I'm stuck, and there's been many times, believe it or not, I don't have all the answers. But when I find myself stuck with someone or in a situation, I have a direct line and a direct call to Dave, and I can pick his brain and sit and listen and to think through holistically what this means and what are my next steps. And so it's just been this beautiful way for us to serve our community even better, because now we have a person of peace who is looking at it from a different perspective that I may not fully understand. And so it's given us this great freedom and opportunity to love and care for people well in providing a bigger constellation of support and care.
Wow, thank you so much, Dave and Doug. What you have shared with us is just such a practical application of exactly what we hoped would happen. You are the picture of what we are encouraging in the Compassion in Action Guide. So we really appreciate what you've shared, the stories you've shared, the obvious trust that has been established between the two of you. And that's really the hope of our efforts, that we are just equipping faith communities around the country to engage with mental health professionals in their community. The next two speakers we have a very similar experience, and we're going to turn to them now. Dr. Glenn Milstein and Rabbi Steinberg are our next speakers. Dr. Glenn Milstein is a licensed clinical psychologist who received his doctorate from Columbia University. He's a tenured associate professor at the City University of New York. Dr. Milstein spent 10 years working and training in psychiatric hospitals. He also trained in a National Institute of Mental Health, one of our NIH agencies, NIMH postdoctoral fellowship, and with Chaplain Amy, I'm going to butcher her name. Forgive me, Glenn. Glenn, you'll have to. Thank you. They developed, researched, and implemented the prevention science-based model of clergy outreach and professional engagement, COPE, to improve the continuity of mental health care. Glenn will share about the COPE model that helps faith and mental health leaders work together. And then we're joined as well by Rabbi Steinberg. Rabbi Steinberg is the rabbi of Landmark Synagogue Congregation Zera Abraham, which has served Denver, Colorado for over 134 years. Rabbi Steinberg is the presiding judge of the, I'm going to butcher this one again, Rabbi Nevi, I'm not sure, the Rabbinical Court will clarify that for me. He's the founder of the Mental Health Task Force in his area and serves as rabbi at the Eating Recovery Center and National Behavioral Health Hospital for Eating Disorders. He provides consultation and training for eating disorder treatment centers nationwide, which address the needs of the observer of kosher law and the Jewish Sabbath. So now we'll turn to Glenn for his presentation. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen.
Thank you. Shannon, thank you very much. And thank you to the partnership as well, because we're, as Dave was pointing out, we're each working in different corners sometimes of the country, and it's only through these kinds of initiatives that we can really speak across to one another. And even in these times of physical distance, these are important social connections. So I'll be speaking very much from the perspective of a clinical psychologist and someone looking at public health. And Rabbi Steinberg and I will be talking about some examples of how we've applied this model of clergy outreach and in some of the collaborations that we've done. And the key is that first is acknowledging that you have different professions, and religion and mental health are not the same, and there are borders between them. And there are ways that we can build bridges. And that one of the main things has to do with how we can communicate with one another and understanding, one is the meaning, and Dave was referring to sometimes we're saying the same things with different words. And then when we talk about how people are dealing very often with mental illness, is what is meaningful to them. And so the key is going to be communication. The key is, how can we, across these different professions and across these different life experiences, bring all of ourselves into the relationship? I didn't create this alone. I've had a lot of collaborators through the years. As we mentioned, Amy Munir and I developed this together many years ago. And I've also had the good fortune of working with Denny Miller and Leslie Steptoe and Jenny Adasi at the Mental Health Center of Denver over the last decade, where we've been implementing from within a comprehensive mental health center, outreach to clergy, which first began with inreach, with talking to the people in the clinic about their interests. And it was the idea of the clinic, and it was at a Pathways to Promise conference that the conversation got started about how I might be able to help build that. And over this decade, they've worked to develop programming within the clinic and worked extensively to reach out, which is how they came to work with Rabbi Steinberg. We've also had a bit of grant funding for our research over the years. So why religion? Why would psychology, why would psychiatry need to bother with religion? We know that there have been times where people have seen the two areas as actually not just different, but even opposed to one another. And the simple truth is that if you find humans, you find religion. Essentially, everywhere there's humanity, there is religion. And so just simply, religion is real. It's there. And so the part of the key to communication, part of the key to bridging these borders, is acknowledging that for the purpose of these dialogues, we don't need to have a conversation about whether or not religion is true or which of these many religions is true. That's not the issue here. The issue is, where there's pain, what can we do collectively to reduce that? And if we look again and think about what is religion from a lifespan point of view, it's the foundation of most cultures. Therefore, it's in your life from a very early age, from infancy, from school age through adolescence, and then as an adult. And it organizes our lives. And so it very often is the source of hope and affirmation, which we're going to talk a bit more about. And it simultaneously can be a source of rejection and denigration. And that was some of what was talked about before, where people struggle with the stigma of mental illness. So if we think from that perspective, we can take a minute and realize, well, most mental illness doesn't cause dysfunction. It doesn't debilitate until later in life, which means that most of who I am is already formed. So that if religion has been part of someone's life, it is an obligation of the clinician to find out about that, because you can also be talking about a reclamation of hopeful strength that came earlier. And we've had examples of this when we've spoken to people, and we were asking caregivers of persons with serious mental illness about their experience of caring for their family member. And we asked a mother if she thought her son's schizophrenia would ever be cured. And her answer was, si Dios hace la obra, él se va a sanar, aunque los doctores digan que él va a ser así siempre. She said to us, if God performs the deed, he will get well, even though the doctors say he will always be like this. So clearly there was a miscommunication. There was this idea that there's not just a border, but a boundary. And she had to keep her faith on one side of that. And for another mother, she said that her faith was part of her strength, right? Her meaningfulness. I think the best thing I can have is prayer. I would be lost without my religion. So how do we bridge these borders? What is a way that we can take a step back and say that they are not in opposition, and then there is a complementarity? As one person with schizophrenia put it, medications may help one's behavior become more acceptable to society. His experience, they do nothing to put one's shattered soul back together. So again, as we talked about before, some of this is about language. You know, how do we bridge clinical treatment? And what does it mean to heal a shattered soul? And notice the language. And notice how the language of religion more often gives us a vocabulary that feels more like the experience of mental illness itself. The sense of loss that a parent has and that an individual has feels like this loss of something core for which religion has a vocabulary. And so how do we build that communication? So one of the ideas that we came up with at the Mental Health Center of Denver is to get everyone in the room together. Let us have what we call the trios. Have persons with lived experience, have their clergy, and have their clinician come together for a conference to talk about how it's of one, they're one team, if you will. And what was very interesting is we immediately had many people who had services at the clinic who volunteered to speak. And the clergy knew that this person had mental health care. The clinician knew something about the religious life of the person. It was the first time the clergy and the clinician met each other, and many more dialogues ensued after that. And so we had, after establishing this collaboration, we had this conference. It was a half-day meeting of dialogue. And one of the participants, one of the speakers, when she spoke about what it was for her, again, to understand the language of the people with whom we worked, she said, you know, she had started taking better care of herself when she really came to understand that God does not make junk, that through her faith, she saw her life as worthwhile, whatever the struggles. And this was a process. Another woman spoke about how she kind of separated from community intervention and then spent a lot of time in nature before gradually coming back to a religious congregation that, as she said, gave her a solid welcome. So how do we engage these strengths? How do we find out about meaning and meaningfulness? And how do we do that when there are 236 different denominations in the United States? There aren't 236 treatments for depression. So what you have also is over 300,000 congregations in the United States. So if we were at a 30,000 view, I'm now taking it as a 100,000 foot view to look across the whole country and say, there's many opportunities for these dialogues if we can get them right. And so we developed this model, this COPE model, that would match the scale where we're going to talk about pathways of dialogue that apply to any of these congregations, because the key is to understand our different expertise. This model of clergy outreach and professional engagement lets us know when to communicate with one another, because it begins with an acknowledgement that clergy have an expertise in religion and culture, that clinicians and research scientists have an expertise in assessment and treatment, and that we're going to reduce all of our burden and provide better care through this continuum of recovery, yes, and wellness. And one of the things that's very often missing in these conversations is, where's the wellness? We talk about what happens when the problem occurs and how do we respond to that problem. Where's the wellness? And so we look, if you see at this diagram, you're looking at 4 hexagons, and they're getting smaller and they're getting more shaded. And the symbols there are that the larger the hexagon, the more people pertain to that hexagon. And the more shading, the more severe the challenge to the individual. So what do we mean by that? When we're talking to the community, wellness is something we all work toward. We try to eat right, we try to sleep, we try to exercise. that is a universal need. We want to have good connection to community. We want to have a sense of hope, a sense of taking care of the next generation. That's simple health. And we all have stress in our communities. We all have stress in our lives. Right now, every one of us, every human on the planet is experiencing a very real level of stress. And for many, many people, they're trying to make sense through a sense of spiritual coherence. And that's what we need, and that's what we do to thrive. Then dysfunction happens, and now you see that it's a smaller, more shaded area. And this is that moment where, as was discussed before, I know there's something wrong. I don't know what it is as the clergy. Let me reach out to a clinician, and the clinician will bring expertise. And the clinician, in turn, will have a relationship with clergy to be able to answer some of those questions. You know, again, as Dave referred to before, rather than not talking about God, how about let's help you figure out how to talk about God as a clinician. And finally, there are those people for whom mental illness is chronic. And so how do we build a team to get everyone to work together for that? And so when talking to clergy, it's about what you already do by having a congregation, by having a community, by providing positive attitudes. And how you already help is you provide spiritual coherence and community support when people have stressors, when people have problems with employment. And the most frequent stressor that clergy respond to is bereavement. It is only after that there may be something so serious it needs care. And then you as a clergy can be very helpful in the total process. So we've broken it into three pathways, and I'm going to invite Rabbi Steinberg to join us now and give us some examples as we go through. Hello, Rabbi Steinberg.
Hello there.
Okay. So what we've talked and we a lot. And so the first pathway, which I really want people to pay attention to, is this idea that there's a lot good that happens before any clinicians are involved, right? You have the stressors of bereavement. You have the other stressors that happen. And then through community support, through family, friends, community, congregations, we get better. No clinicians involved. Rabbi, are there examples that you have of that?
Yeah, sure. Now, when we're talking about wellness, we are talking about in the context of mental health. And it is no doubt, as was expressed by every one of the panelists, that religion exists, religion is real. As you've said before, Glenn, whether it's true or not, it is real, and it's very much part of a person's makeup, and it's recognized. In the context of mental health, it's going to be religion, which is going to give the person a sense, for those individuals who are religious, the sense of self-worth, ambition, meaning, and it's those things that give them the sense of wellness. So, of course, the clergy is the one who is giving that basis, the foundational mental health for the individual within the community and the collective community. So certainly, clergy is so much a part of every religious individual as far as the ability to thrive with good mental health. Would you want me to address stress and loss now?
And yes, please. Yes.
And with regard to stress and loss, that is of course obvious. So much about bereavement counseling is pastoral counseling. Oftentimes, at a moment of loss is when a person may have some spiritual, ideological recognition. They turn to their religion for a sense of meaning within the loss. Of course, in many religions, a death is seen as a transition between a worldly existence to a metaphysical existence. So this, of course, is always going to have context within religion. And before even introducing the clinician, just having that basis for a path of understanding and process is certainly going to be fall within the jurisdiction of the clergy.
And
go ahead.
You experience bereavement in your community frequently. Do you very often need a clinician to get someone through the mourning process or the bereavement process?
Not very often, but often enough. and just engaging with the family or with the individual to be aware and to be able to gauge and keep a sense of a finger on the pulse, to be able to say, this is normative, this is where their intervention is required. It's necessary that that relationship with the clergy already exists so that the clergy can start making the next step, the clinical assessment and referral for treatment.
And so there's that point where the normative grief and bereavement does not lead back to wellness. And so there's what we'd call the treatment pathway, this assessment and treatment pathway. What are times when you've had to make referrals?
One could easily imagine that there are certain losses which are hard to absorb for anyone and can really put somebody in a place of dysfunction. One, I'll admit that there's, as clergy, one, as was said earlier by Pastor Doug, we don't have all the answers, and one who does, doesn't. So I'll give an example of a loss which oftentimes I see does tend to allow the individual to degenerate, and that's a loss of a child. It's so hard to put that into context of, there's the memories aren't there, the life story is not there, and there's very little to celebrate where the child has not yet achieved any sense of maturity. That's been a common example. That's as far as bereavement and loss. Of course, there are so many other areas where assessment is required, where it's a simple mental health dysfunction, whether it's an anxiety and a depression or what can be later diagnosed as a serious behavioral disorder. And I want to step back just for a moment. Clergy, there's also the religious community. We have an expression in Judaism, there is no king without a nation. And the clergy does not exist on his own. And I think this really falls back to, again, what was said by Pastor Doug. Community is an integral part of the service that the clergy provides. Oftentimes, just the awareness of when dysfunction may be existing and the necessity for assessment oftentimes does come from other members within the religious community, within the church.
That's a very good point.
And that's not to be divorced. Right. I think that the clergy should take all the credit. Okay.
That's a really good point. And then, do you also have members of your community who have more chronic illnesses that are in need of kind of regular maintenance and observation?
Sure. Glenn, you and I have spoken about a organization which I direct, which was described earlier by David. We call it the Areva Mental Health Task Force. Areva is a Hebrew word which means co-responsibility. And it is a community-based mental health task force. And aside for referral and case management, which is done by clergy with a robust clearinghouse of mental health professionals with which we share experience, all the clergy in the city share experience, and we're able to make appropriate referral based on that. In addition, there is a strong community element. And indeed, I know that some of the members of our lay committee within our task force are actually listening in on this to learn more about the kind of work that you and David do. That element of community is paramount for the function of a good mental health task force, especially within a close-knit community such as a synagogue or a church or a mosque. So certainly there are times when situations become so complex, one needs to involve the educator, one needs to involve regular clergy, and needs to involve community to help the family, to help the child, to help the parent. Here's situations where within our task force, we've been able to identify volunteer guardianship, where we have a ward who is totally incapacitated, and we need to have somebody within the community that's trusted to serve as guardianship. So we've done that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there's sometimes where things have become so complex, where that guardianship has eventually led back to your wellness, following that fourth arrow.
Okay. I think that is our cue. And we are at the end here. So we want to thank everybody. Shannon, welcome back.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate what you shared. And Rabbi, your comment about co-responsibility is just beautiful. That is exactly what we're seeking to encourage here, is that kind of co-responsibility happening in communities around the country. Our Surgeon General Adams, has commented that you don't necessarily have a clinical presence in every town of America, but you do have several faith communities. You can't throw a stone in any town in America without hitting a faith community, he says. So having the working together with clinicians and faith partners is just a really beautiful picture of that co-responsibility. We do have a lot of questions, and so I'd love to see Doug and Dave join us as well, and we'll get to as many as we can. The first one that I think is just such an important question that came in is how it is that you maintain confidentiality when you're doing the referrals that you're doing back and forth to each other in your work. How do you maintain confidentiality? Whoever wants to take it.
I mean, I could speak to a couple things. One is, at least within a number of organizations on the mental health side, they are licensed providers with their own regulations that they're responsible for. So oftentimes we're trying to meet those programs where they're at and ensure that what compliance looks like in one program may be a little bit different, but also we add with that just the best practice of doing whatever the person feels comfortable with, because we've noticed a lot of diversity between people that we say, hey, how do you want us to talk about you with this faith community representative we're going to connect you with? So we always want to start where the person's at and be mindful of the regulatory standards of each program we work with.
Of course. And so when you have a client who would like to be connected with that faith leader, are there forms that you have them sign to give you specific permission to do that? How do you facilitate that?
Certainly, there's every time that there's a request for engagement with myself or other members within our task force, the clergy members within our task force, of course, there's an ROI which is submitted in compliance. In addition, I think that this is, if I may, just to add additional comment, and I think Pastor Doug could relate to this. So often we are turned to because we are trusted.
Right.
And that's such a strong power. It's sometimes even necessary to enable the very crucial trust which needs to exist between the patient and the therapist. And clergy can facilitate that trust by good referral. And knowing that there'll also be, things will be kept private and things will be kept, the privacy will be respected, is something which I think we serve in a great position to be able to facilitate some, good mental health addressing.
That's terrific. Glenn, Doug?
Well, certainly at the Mental Health Center at Denver, it's, part of it is you can reach out without really needing to speak to anything about an illness. And there's no need to have clinical language really at all. I met with the Psychiatric Society of Queens at one point, and they were very excited about teaching the DSM to clergy. And we had to explain that, no, clergy have their expertise, and we have our expertise. There's a border. And so when it's really when it becomes conversations around meaningfulness and sort of these more holistic ideas, that's in a sense, a philosophical conversation that you don't necessarily have to worry about confidentiality, you know. And the clinical terms aren't something that most of the clergy we work with are interested in taking on as a further burden. That's part of the idea of helping one another.
Right. And the
I would
sense
also,
of community they can create is different than
Right.
what you do in your clinical office. Sure.
Right. And just to add one other thing, part of the idea too is that there's a cycle to mental illness very often, so that when people are having the greatest severity of symptoms, that's when you can be focused on clinical work. And as one clinician at our conference pointed out, as people got healthier, they became more interested in community involvement. And the community involvement is not about their illness, it's about being a
Right.
generative part of the community. Sorry,
Being
Dave.
connected to other people. Sure.
Yes.
You
yes.
started to say something?
I was just going to say, one of my favorite ways to make connections happen, that's happened with Doug on occasions, is just, I may come with a person, but that person's telling their story to the faith leader. I'm doing very little sharing. And the person's developing skills for themselves that they can use in other parts of life when they get a chance to tell their own story versus it having to come through me or a form. So we use
Nice.
forms when standardized practice says we should, but we also want to encourage people to empower people to tell their
Absolutely.
own stories.
And even
that's-
I really appreciate what Rabbi Steinberg shared. I think there's something so powerful about building trust. And one of the things that is, that has just felt so natural is just to hear the story on its own, you know, hear the story from a person on their own terms, and then to build trust from that point on. It feels like it builds very strong bridges and empowers the folks that we've had a opportunity to work with to see those bridges grow outside of just the pastor and themselves, but into community as well.
Yeah.
And the other piece,
Oh, go ahead, Glenn.
yeah, it's very strong, and part really what we were after with COPE and all this kind of work is letting the person not be their illness. What happens a lot in clinical care is it's so focused on the illness. Did you take your medication? There's not a place for the voice of my personhood. And as I tried to point out before, you have a life that's grown rich before mental illness interferes. And these partnerships allow people both to be who they are and be who they were. And I think that all that, the richness of that language allows for that.
That's good. This discussion really leads into the second question that I wanted to touch on, and that really more directed to Rabbi and to Doug. When someone is sitting in your office and you are sensing that this may be more significant than just a regular grief or a regular struggle that would be typical of someone, you think maybe there is a more significant concern going on. How do you walk through that process of referring? How do you just give us the how-tos of how you do that for those who are listening who have struggled with that question?
Doug, you first.
Thank you, Rabbi. A few things. I think the first thing is, because of Intersect, I've been able to be open to become aware of counseling services and other services within the county that are that I might be able to match and say, hey, it sounds like this might be a really good fit for you to just check out. Can I go with you? So I think in some ways I'm very quick to refer, but I'm also I feel like a pastor's role or a spiritual leader's role in someone is also to journey with them in that. And it might be it might be driving them to the first session and sitting in the room next door while that's happening, and then them coming out and then just being able to process on the way home. Like, how are you feeling? What does it look like for us to walk with you and to care for you and love you? So yeah, I think just knowing Dave has been really a great resource too, because we understand if it's a homelessness issue or something that's moving that direction, then, you know, I know who to call. If someone's talking about suicide, I can call mobile crisis. So I feel like just almost like having having that connection with Dave has offered me this bigger list of resources that helps me to just roll through as I'm listening well. And I think too, even just connecting with some of the local counseling centers and knowing which ones are more geared towards which places has also been another great opportunity for me, just as I'm sitting with someone.
Nice. Rabbi?
Making a referral in my community, we tend to have challenges, very strong resistance. People are reticent to seek any kind of mental health assistance. That reticence comes from, there's a stigma. In our community, we're generally close-knit. Somebody seeking a job, very often it's within the community. The way that marriages occur, oftentimes it's within the community, and people are concerned that if they're going to see a therapist, they're going to go into treatment, that's going to lessen their odds of getting a good job or marrying making a good marriage. So that's one level of stigma, which is very difficult to attempt to overcome. So that's something which I have to spend time with. Oftentimes there's a unwillingness to recognize. One of the things that I do is before indicating to somebody, this is dysfunction, you need to follow through with this with treatment or therapies, I'll actually give them a book. I like to use William Knaus's workbooks. He has some for depression, anxiety, or different disorders. I say, hey, why don't you look at this, tell me if it speaks to you. And oftentimes they'll come back and say, this is describing me exactly, and then we're able to move on from there.
Very nice.
One of the very serious issues to overcome is within, and speaks so strongly to our discussion today, which is seeing the borders, seeing where the expertise exists, that the expertise for treating mental illness is with the clinicians. The expertise about religious belief is with the clergy, and that should be strongly recognized, and those borders should be clearly maintained. The bridges are really helpful after those borders are clarified. So oftentimes somebody would say, I cannot seek treatment because the therapist, the treatment team will toy with technology. I cannot send my child to treatment because they're going to lose their religion on the way. This is something very important to be able to address. I also say that they are concerned, especially when they're going to a treatment team, as let's say with the eating disorder, they're always concerned that their religious practices will be viewed as compulsive behavior.
Right.
And that kind of connection, that bridge between clergy and the clinician will be able to help identify what's indeed normative. The other flip side of that is that oftentimes religion is used by an individual who is ill as an excuse for their abnormative and their bad behavior. So they'll say, well, this is what my religion demands of me. And that's again where a connection with clergy is so helpful. When the applicant will hear all this, they'll become more comfortable, particularly if they know there'll be some kind of stewardship with the clergy and the clinician to see that the thing is moving along in a way which is not contrary to the religious beliefs.
So that trust allows them to be more at ease as they go into the treatment protocol.
Sure. And Shannon, if I may add to that, and it speaks to a point that was made earlier, I for one, am not in favor of teaching clergy the DSM. I'm also not in favor of teaching clinicians about religion because they're not going to get it right. And there are so many nuances. And when a trust is, the attempt is made to build trust because of commonality of religion or an understanding of religion, where the clinician says, oh, I understand everything about Judaism. I understand everything about Islam. It doesn't work well. It's not just to say, I understand that it exists. I don't quite get the idea of it, but I can get rabbi involved. I can get imam involved. I can get pastor.
Right. No, I think one of the things that we stress in the Compassion in Action Guide is the importance of understanding appropriate boundaries and each person operating within the expertise and the calling that they have. So the clinician being a great clinician and working with the faith leader, and the faith leader being a great faith leader, providing a sense of community to that individual, but working with the clinician. We are running late, but I have one more question that I just have to get to. So Glenn and Dave, would love to hear your thoughts on how your models apply to various faith traditions, because we here in the center serve the entire American people, those of faith and those of no faith, those of every faith. And so how do your specific models address multiple faith traditions? Glenn, you go first.
You want me to go first?
Sure, you go.
The whole point of COPE is to say there are borders. And so you begin with, the first thing you do is you begin by asking your clinical setting if there's a real interest in understanding that religion is real and what that means across 236 denominations, which means partnership with multiple congregations, with multiple denominations. And so COPE is that idea of creating first an inreach that says, yes, I want to do this, I want this relationship, then the outreach that says, I want to hear from you how I can be of service to you, I the clinician, and that I'm not here to change anybody's religion, I am here to help people. And we do know that sometimes in the clinical setting, it is religion that has made the wounds in people's lives. And so that's where probably things get most complex, is letting that be a part of the therapy. But in terms of across denominations, you do it by not presuming you know, and by using this whole idea of bridges to learn and to be in dialogue so that you can get it right. And as both Rabbi Steinberg and Pastor Doug pointed out, they're willing to talk and to help you with both sides of it, because it's very important to know that both you want to help heal someone, you also sometimes want to call them on what they're telling you their religion will and won't allow.
Right. That's good. Dave, any other thoughts?
I would just say there's a little bit of a both and that we've had to pay attention to. On the one hand, we want to meet people where they are, and whatever they're saying about their experience of faith will dictate what sorts of connections we make. So that has led at times to certain communities being tapped more because it just has started with the individual and what they're communicating. That said, it's been really helpful for us ahead of time to collaborate with, Doug talked about that persons of peace. So for us to have people within the Jewish community, have people within the Muslim community and other communities who are waiting in the wings, so that I don't have to be all things to all people in one way, and that I know who I am, I know my faith tradition and what I know and what I don't know. So in the same way that we've been saying, it's helpful for me to know I can call this person who's a gateway into that community, call that person who's a gateway. So I can still be a connector while knowing my limits.
Nice. So the bridge builder, the connector, that's the role, pardon me, that you can play to better serve people who are experiencing these things as they desire that to be a part of their treatment protocol. That's really so good. Guys, we could go on. Oh, did you have something else, Lynn?
And as Rabbi Steinberg pointed out, very often it's not the clergy, it's some other member of the congregation. Then some congregations are large, and so they have a social services clergy, so who those point people are is part of that outreach education.
Terrific.
That was good. Yeah.
So I'm sure we could go on because this has been a really interesting discussion. I really appreciate each of you for joining us today and sharing your expertise and your experience with our guests. who've been here with us today. For those who have watched, thank you so much for joining. We will be sending a link to the recording of today's program to everyone who registered for the program today. So watch for that follow-up email that will have that link included. We also want to make sure that you know about our final webinar in this series. September 15th will be the final webinar, 5th of 5 in the Compassion in Action series. And that program will be dealing with the 6th and 7th principles in the Compassion in Action Guide, the complexities principle about the complexities of mental illness, and the hope principle about the importance of hope as we're walking with people who are experiencing mental illness and their caregivers. So please join us again on September 15th. The registration link will be in the email that you receive after this program. So we are hoping that you'll be able to join us for that as well. And if you have questions that were not addressed today, please feel free to email us at partnerships with an S, partnerships@hhs.gov, and we will follow up with you on any further questions that you have. It's been a privilege to be with you today. We appreciate each of our speakers who joined us and shared their experience, and we thank you as our guests for joining us. Have a great day.
Have a good day.
Buddy,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Ben.
Be well.